Hi guys, we'll be talking through landscape connectivity today and some of the content of chapter 5. So a Canadian landscape ecologist first introduced this concept of landscape connectivity as structural connectivity, physical connectivity between landscapes. The definition, the working definition, originally was the degree to which a landscape facilitates or impedes movement among resource patches. But the concept has really been expanded to recognize the different scales and functions of connectivity: dispersal, gene flow, movement of water, material, and nutrients, the negative side of connectivity, such as the spread of invasive species, and the importance for connectivity in maintaining process, such as disturbance mechanisms like fire. So Haddad produced a paper in 2015 that summarized the impacts of fragmentation and how it reduces biodiversity globally. One of the take-home as far as connectivity goes with this quote is that the impacts of fragmentation can be ameliorated by connectivity, and we can see up to a 50% increase in movement by just restoring natural cover between habitat fragments. So I won't read this to you guys, but you can take some time to look at this. It's important to recognize the different types of corridors that we see in the landscape. We have natural features that function as corridors, and movement pathways that have always been a feature of the landscape, such as streams and riparian areas and mountain passes, for instance. We have constructed corridors that have intentionally been created to augment connectivity within regions. That might include wildlife crossings over roads or fish ladders. And then, of course, there are incidental corridors, some of which are themselves fragmenting features or possibly the conduit for negative things, such as the movement of invasive species, which we might see in utility line right-of-ways. Utility line right-of-ways may also serve as an ecological trap for grassland birds because of the high sort of surface area relationship there, the high amount of edge, and the concentration of predators there. And we've talked about that before. So this slide captures the concept that corridors really can just be a strip of land that differs from the matrix on either side. You can see in the top picture that we have a forested matrix with an open habitat corridor running through it. The bottom photo, we have an agricultural matrix with a forested corridor running through it. So corridors can serve as a conduit of movement or act as a barrier or a filter to movement. They can sometimes serve as a barrier for gene flow. We may have animals that aren't willing to cross a corridor between two habitat patches. So, for instance, roads or corridors that can serve as almost a complete barrier to amphibian movement and ultimately isolate populations. So it's important to think about all the different ways that a corridor can interact with a landscape, depending on the perspective of the organism. So it's important to think about the difference between structural versus functional connectivity. And the book goes fairly deep on this concept, but structural connectivity is a function that we can look at within GIS through analyses such as nearest neighbor, where we look at the physical connection of a single habitat type And that's fairly easy to accomplish. It gets a little more difficult when we start to think about functional connectivity. So how does an organism or a suite of organisms view the landscape, and whether or not the organism is able to traverse the landscape despite that sort of physical feature of the habitat. So in our analyses in GIS, we may think about potential connectivity and use our best knowledge of organisms to understand if they may be willing to cross a certain matrix between habitat patches or not. And then we also sometimes have data that gives us a sense of actual connectivity. We may have tag data from organisms that show us their willingness to move between different habitat types and exactly how far. So we'll get into this more, but just keep in mind that structural connectivity tends to be a lens based solely on our knowledge about habitats and how they relate to each other. Functional connectivity is when we take on the lens of the organism that we're interested in to decide whether or not they can move across a landscape. This slide just captures some more terms that you might come across in landscape ecology and the different types of corridors that folks might refer to. These again are physical corridors that conservationists might consider constructing in order to connect large habitat patches. So we've talked about these concepts already, but I want you guys to just keep in mind the potential drawbacks of corridors, the impacts of edge effect that we see for some species, that we often have predators concentrate at those ecotones within a corridor. That ratio of edge to interior habitat imposes a risk to many organisms. And then of course the concept we've already talked about, that some corridors like roads or railroads can be conduits for invasive species and also can be outright barriers for genetic exchange. So we'll hit this concept over and over again. Corridors may seem like an obvious connection between habitat patches, but they really might not be needed if an organism, the organism in question, has the ability to detect and at least cross small habitat gaps. So there's a lot of thought and energy put into connectivity analyses that bear on the best available science for our understanding of organisms in question and their dispersal abilities, their dispersal distance, to help us understand their willingness to move between patches, even in the absence of corridors. So this quote emphasizes that point that connectivity has two dimensions: the dimension of the landscape, which is the structural component of connectivity, and the dimension of the organism, which is the functional component of connectivity. So we're going to get into some of the concepts of how landscape ecologists have analyzed connectivity. And a lot of this relates to how it's used in the context of GIS. So patch connectivity metrics, so just our most simple understanding of connections between habitat patches in a landscape. We can look at very simple metrics of nearest neighbor distance. That's just the simple straight line distance between two patches. We also look at neighborhood measures or buffer measures. That includes all patches within a certain radius of one focal patch of interest, and is often set within the buffer of the maximum dispersal range of the species or organism that we're interested in. So this is the simplest and most used neighborhood measure is the Euclidean nearest neighbor, the ENN. And the third one we'll talk about is incidence function model measures. So this weights the contribution of each patch to a focal patch. So we often start with a patch of interest, and then we're looking at the other patches surrounding that. And it actually weights the contributing value of the patches within that landscape, where large new patches are likely to be a functional source for immigration than small far patches. So, sound familiar? That's clearly built on Wilson and MacArthur's theory of island biogeography. So scientists wrestle with which patch connectivity measure to use. The best measure of connectivity is not necessarily the most complex or biologically realistic. Some of the patch connectivity models we've just talked about really are maybe best used when the matrix is homogeneous, or when adjustments are made to incorporate a better biological understanding of organisms and this concept of effective isolation by actually weighting resistance of certain habitats and an organism's willingness to move through it. So it's important to recognize that some studies have actually shown that patch connectivity measures and models may not fully explain occupancy or colonization of certain species. So these rely heavily on structural connectivity and don't always include, our best understanding of functional connectivity. The book goes into a fair amount of detail on neutral landscape models. These are grid-based raster maps where habitat patterns can be randomly generated. They help us understand the theoretical features of connectivity. And they help us understand how real landscapes actually can deviate from these theoretical landscapes. They give us a baseline or a null hypothesis on which to base some of our studies. So they've been used to understand when landscapes become disconnected, when a landscape percolates. It depends on the neighborhood rule that we use, and that again is usually defined by our understanding of the organism and their willingness to cross certain landscapes. So the picture below shows 3 different habitat patterns depending on the neighborhood rule that's used. So rule 3 uses a 12-cell neighborhood, and that captures the concept of an organism that's willing to cross small gaps. You can see how different the landscape pattern looks depending on an organism's perspective of fragmenting features in that landscape. So here's some examples of how neutral landscape models are being used, and they have quite a bit of application now. They can be used to look at the effect of landscape connectivity and the movement of fire based on our understanding of fire behavior and landscape features. They've used in studies of percolation in modeled landscapes, again to kind of create a null hypothesis. They've been used to help us understand a species perspective of a landscape based on certain focal species' willingness to move across small gaps in heterogeneous landscapes. We can look at plant dispersal and species coexistence. We can look at the relative effect of habitat area versus fragmentation and some of the community patterns that result. So graph theories start to blend some of the features of patch-based analyses and landscape approaches to assessing connectivity. They require a good bit of spatial information. They look at the spatial arrangement of habitat patches that we've referred to as nodes within graph theory. And then we look at how those habitat patches might be structurally or functionally connected. So we can look at distance between those patches, but then also apply our knowledge of an organism's willingness to move across the intervening matrix and add functional distance or weight various connections based on the matrix. And we look at those connections are referred to as edges. And this concept really gets applied to the next type of connectivity we'll look at as well. So graph theory, because it includes more information about functional connectivity, has been used to describe such things as connectivity in marine environments, species perceptions of network connectivity. So it incorporates, as we said, that functional view of how the species views a landscape. We can incorporate source-seek dynamics, metapopulation dynamics in landscape networks, as well as directional flows. So our understanding of organisms' movement based even on the physical configuration. For example, for marine organisms, we know that larval dispersal of some coral species is going to be limited directionally based on ocean currents, and that's a feature that we could incorporate. So grid-based simulations allow us to capture the differential movement of organisms through different habitat types. This simulation could start with a hypothetical population within a patch and actually determine the number of those individuals that we might see dispersing to other patches based on their distance, based on the likelihood of mortality in moving to another habitat patch, and their willingness to cross the intervening matrix. Least-cost paths and resistance surface models can assume organisms' willingness to minimize the costs as they move through a certain matrix. So this analysis really can combine the habitat quality. It can measure straight line distances, or it can determine what we would call the effective distance by applying resistance to movement through certain habitat types. That's the equivalent to what we just talked about with the weighted edges in the graph theories. So these sorts of models, such as calculation of least cost paths, are now a common feature in GIS packages. The book had this nice example of a resistant kernel estimator that was used for woodland salamanders. The B figure here is the kernel estimator that shows darker contours with the higher probability of salamanders arriving at their vernal pools for breeding. But figure C looks at that same landscape and includes some resisting features in the landscape, such as roads and other barriers to salamander dispersal. So circuit theory is an approach that we've seen used a lot in landscape ecology more recently. It's used to identify movement corridors and evaluate connectivity, but was actually adapted from electrical circuit theory. And it's found to outperform a lot of the other models. This is a great quote from the Nature Conservancy's Regional Connectivity Report by Mark Anderson, and I thought you would enjoy reading it. It describes one type of circuit theory model called CircuitScape that TNC applied to understand how organisms were likely to move regionally in light of climate change. So I won't read it to you, but take the time to read through this. So how do we measure resistance within the landscape? A lot of these models that we've discussed apply some knowledge about an organism's willingness or ability to move between habitat patches, quality known habitats that we anticipate they would occupy. And a lot of times we don't have perfect information to base our assumptions on. A lot of times we use expert opinion to decide this sort of resistance weight that we might apply to certain habitat types. Quantifying movement behavior is a challenge, and we have to account for the different scales of movement. What type of movement are we thinking about when we are modeling? At what scale? A lot of times we look at dispersal distance, which is going to be different than home range movements or foraging behavior. So we see different scales of movement that are often different temporally as well. And that's an important functional consideration for our models. Often detection data is easier to accumulate than actual movement data for organisms. And so that's an important feature. What we've found in analyses of some of these studies is that detection data does not necessarily match what our theories are about movement and dispersal pressures. And then finally, genetic data. When we do apply genetic data to these types of studies, there's some temporal uncertainty around that. Current genetic conditions don't necessarily capture present-day landscape conditions. There's a lag there. So just a note to say there are many, many challenges in creating these models. And as they've become more complex, they really have become more prone to potential error as well. It takes a little bit of time just to talk about the special feature of rivers in the landscape and the fact that we can actually look at rivers as three-dimensional in the way we consider connectivity of our river systems. So we talk about longitudinal connectivity within a river, and that's just the straight line degree to which upstream and downstream sections of a river are connected. We may think of dams as obstructing features within longitudinal connectivity of a rivers that restricts the flow of sediments, nutrients, organic matter, and of course can obstruct movement of organisms. Lateral connectivity refers to that flow that occurs beyond the banks of a river as a result of periodic flooding or even the daily flooding that we see within the tidal zone. So isolation of rivers from their floodplains alters the dynamic structure and process of the feature of and the function of floodplains and the habitats that are created. And then we've got this concept of vertical connectivity, and that refers to the exchange between the river and the atmosphere and the groundwater. It captures everything from the input of rainfall events and groundwater recharge. And so features such as impervious surfaces and wells are both disruptors to vertical connectivity in rivers. And this slide captures those three different types of connectivity as the figure from your book. And that's all I've got.